Hi, welcome back to Cybersecurity for Everyone. I'm Dr. Charles Harry. In our last video, we talked about some practical examples of real-world hacks that have occurred and which highlighted some of the complexities that we have to deal with in terms of differences in the threat actors, the hackers we face, their motives, the tactics that they use, and the end effects. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about some of the practical questions facing policymakers and the constraints they have to solving some of those questions. And so some of the practical questions that they have to deal with are things like, does the government have the right to read my communications? And what if they're part of a criminal investigation versus if it's part of an intelligence operation? What does that dividing line look like? What are some of the authorities that are required? And depending on which country you're talking about, whether it's the United States or China or Russia or the Central African Republic, they're going to have different authorities based on their own governance structures. So you need to think about which country you're dealing with and some of the complications associated with specific questions. You might have to ask questions about, should governments use specific cyber tools to engage in certain types of asymmetric forms of warfare or espionage? And how do you enforce such standards where you might want to draw a line, where you say that some targets are off limits versus some which are not? What sort of regulatory powers should the government assert to govern critical infrastructure? Should it even do so? Right? These are questions that have to be asked. Is the problem of cybersecurity simply a private problem, or is it a broader public problem? How do you make that determination? How do you differentiate between the two? These are really, really complicated questions that have to be asked. And can free speech be censored? If so, in what cases? Depending on what country you go to around the world, they're going to have different answers to that question. The position in the United States might be really quite different than what you find in the Russian Federation, which might be actually quite different than what you find in Germany. So we need to ask these questions. But those questions, that policy space, these broad policy questions that we hear so much debate in the news, is constrained. And what I mean by constraints is that unlike when living in a free society where you're able to do whatever you would like unless it is illegal, policymakers face the opposite problem. You are not actually able to undertake certain activities unless you are authorized to. This is a fundamental problem. So there are some constraints in policymaking simply based on, do you have the right? Does the government have the right to actually act in this space? And so some practical areas or practical constraints that policymakers may have to deal with when dealing with the problem of cybersecurity might include things like, well, what do you actually mean by a cyber event? That may have a very specific definition and meaning for a government. Is a website defacement against a private company something that the government even deems to be what they would call a cyber event? That may be a good question. There might be another question about jurisdiction. Is this a private matter, a local issue, a national problem, an international problem? Who has ownership of this issue? Is it the county government? Is it state government, federal government, or is it a matter for a community of nations? Should I cooperate or not cooperate in cyberspace? And there might be a decision calculus for that. And then finally, how do I enforce a particular point of view on cyber? If I think that a cybersecurity incident has occurred that is of public concern, how do I actually enforce my will on the other side? How do I respond? Do I send a harsh letter, something we call a démarche? Do I generate sanctions, financial sanctions, travel sanctions? If so, what are the conditions and against who? How do I, potentially engage in precision strikes if I think that makes sense? Or in the most absurd example, do I want to engage in nuclear retaliation? Probably not likely to occur. But these are fundamental questions for the policymaker. And so these are constraints for policymakers when they want to try to address some of those practical questions. So the takeaway here is that the threat, the number of threats, the complexity of the threats is a problem for the policymaker. And they want to leverage, policymakers, remember, their fundamental goal is to leverage technology and to minimize the risks. And so in order to understand the cybersecurity problem, we need to explore the threat landscape. We need to understand the internet, how it evolved, how it works. We need to understand hackers and their motives. We need to understand the techniques they use and what the process of hacking actually is. We need to understand the effects they can engineer. We need to understand the broader attack surface in which it operates in. So next time, we want to talk about the history and evolution of the internet. We're going to deep dive into the first part of the threat landscape. I hope to see you next time.